Good afternoon, and welcome to the 6th Annual Charleston Literary Festival. I'm Leah Ryan, one of the many faces you'll see working behind the scenes this week. You'll see me running around like a crazy person. I will say it feels great to be back at the Circular Congregational Church today, which was one of our first venues way back in 2017, which lately feels like a very long time ago. The world has changed since then. So much it's been hard to fathom, but one thing that hasn't changed about the Charleston Literary Festival is our willingness to use this space to talk about hard things. No topic has ever been too controversial, and our commitment to civil discourse is unwavering. That said, if you had told me 5 years ago that gender would be a controversial topic, I would have looked at you funny. Gender, controversial? But today, as people begin to find the language to describe their gender identities in whole new ways, it has become controversial. Some people want to cling to tradition, others see a world opening wide for the first time. So we, as a festival, want to talk about it. To do so, we turn to the science of psychology. Tonight, it is my absolute honor to introduce Dr. Frans de Waal, the C.H. Candler Professor of Psychology at Emory University, and the director of the Living Links Center at the Yerkes National Primate Research Center. His books are numerous. They include Mama's Last Hug, The Bonobo and the Atheist, and The Age of Empathy. His newest book, Different, takes a deep dive into gender roles and sexuality throughout the animal kingdom. And spoiler alert, it's not as clear-cut as you think. Here with him today is Dr. Jennifer Wilhelm, the Director of Experiential Learning and Director of HSS LEAP at the College of Charleston. She is a professor of psychology, and she told me she's the director of the Women's Gender Studies, and I wrote it down and my notes are terrible and I apologize. Professor of Women's and Gender Studies, thank you. She also earned her PhD at Emory University, so now we've kind of come full circle. Before I invite them to the stage, we have a couple of moments of brief housekeeping. First, Dr. de Waal has graciously agreed to sign books after his session. Please do stop by and visit him at the Buxton Bookstore in the back of the room. Also, the Charleston Literary Festival absolutely would not exist without the generosity of our many wonderful donors. Tonight's session has been sponsored by Patty Manigo, and we could not be more grateful. Also, this is a really good time to remind the house to turn down the lights and to remind you all to silence your cell phones. So without any further ado and me stumbling over words, Dr. Frans de Waal and later Dr. Jennifer Wilhelm.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I had really enjoyed getting to see the videos of some of these animals that you write about in your book. So one of the reviews I was reading of your book said something to the effect of, you must be crazy to go into this field to talk about gender and sexuality. This is about the 40th anniversary of your first book. So why was now the time for you to write about sex differences and gender among the things that you've observed?
Yeah, it is risky, but I'm retired and the risk is lower, I think. And in addition, I don't feel that I take an extreme position. Some people may feel it's extreme, and some people get very upset when you say there are biological sex differences in behavior. But I think the majority of people understands, especially people who have had boys and girls at home, they understand that there are some differences.
I know that some of the concepts you talked about in previous books, that you talk about in this book, that the term alpha male was kind of co-opted, and you have a little disdain about how it may have gotten co-opted by political and popular culture, and that it's really been used to kind of highlight these behaviors that are maybe more bullying and violent of nature or dominant in nature rather than some of the behaviors that you have observed. So I was curious, why do you think that our culture has kind of really taken on to this idea of this dominant, more pushy alpha male, and why has the alpha female not taken off in our popular culture?
Yeah. So I'm partly responsible because my book Chimpanzee Politics mentioned alpha males quite a bit, and then Newt Gingrich recommended it to freshman congressmen in Washington, and then the word alpha male was used by everyone. And now if you go to the business book section, you'll find how to be an alpha male. And what they mean is how to let everyone know that you're the boss and hit them over the head every day and let them know and attract women, that's part of it also. And so they have a very narrow view of what an alpha male is. And I think business leaders, the ones that I talk with, they also recognize that that's a very narrow view. You don't want to be a man like that. But that's now the view. And then alpha females are overlooked. It's partly also because the word alpha has gotten this negative connotation, I think, is that it's a bully, and so they don't associate that with women, even though I think women can also be bullies. So I think it has become a bit of a mess. The word alpha male is used very frequently in animal studies, alpha male and alpha female, and for us it just means, it is not a personality type, it just means the top of the hierarchy, the one who's at the top. And it is not a reflection on what kind of behavior they show. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting you talked about some of the differences in male and female chimpanzees in terms of conflict resolution, and thinking about that in these alpha male versus alpha female situations. And I think you said that the males were more peacemaking and the females were more peacekeeping. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and how do you see that maybe play out in other species?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm a biologist, but I'm in a psychology department, and I read all these psychology textbooks, and they have a very strange view of man, I think. I'm from a family of 6 boys, and so I relate very easily to men. And they describe them in these textbooks. Men are very competitive, they're very hierarchical, they cannot really make friends, their friendships are not very deep, and they live in a competitive world. But you know, there's many men, and I'm sure there's many men here in the room who have male friends and they like to hang out with them. And so if it was such a competitive, terrible situation, why would we do that? We have fun together. And so they have a very negative sort of competitive view. And men actually, they have a lot of conflicts, and male chimpanzees are exactly the same. They have a lot of conflicts, but they reconcile them also very easily, and they don't talk about it the next day. It's forgotten, sort of. And that's not the case for females. The female chimpanzees, they hold grudges, I think, and they... And that's why for the females, because conflicts are so serious and taken so seriously, they try to avoid them. And so in the chimpanzee, I think the males have a peacemaking strategy. It's like you have a fight, and then you reconcile, and you kiss, and you groom, and then it goes on like that. It cycles through fights and reconciliations. And the females have a strategy, let's stay away from her because I have problems with her. And so they... and it's usually within gender. The conflicts are usually, and that's in human society also, I think the competition is mostly within gender. And the females have a strategy of staying away from problems. And in the business books that I've read, I've noticed that, and there's some psychologists who have done studies on this, is that women, they call it ruminating. Women think more about their relationships and about the fights that they've had, and they're much more affected, and so they get more burnouts if there is too much competition in a company, for example. And so they suffer more from conflict than men do. And so it makes sense for women to avoid that kind of conflicts more than men would do. Yeah, there are several of these observations that people say that if you go to a board meeting, for example, that the men will be shouting and yelling at each other and have big fights at the board meeting, and then they go, during a break, they all go to the bathroom and they laugh and they joke and they laugh and they joke, and then they go back to the boardroom and start the fight over again. And that seems to me typical male behavior.
After I read that part of the book, it sparked some conversations with me and my husband about our conflict resolution styles. Thinking about, these differences that you talk about in males and females and conflict resolution and otherwise, has got me thinking about my children. And so I have a 12-year-old and 12 and 10-year-old boys and an 8-year-old daughter. And when my boys were first born, it was very popular to try to raise your children in a gender-neutral way. That was a lot of the popular press at the time, was trying to really encourage parents to not socialize gender, and to try to let your child be who they are. So I, in an effort to do this, was very proud when I was pregnant to go and buy my child a purple kitchen and all of the dolls, and was very disappointed whenever he took the spoons from the kitchen and were beating on the dolls and using them as guns. And then, so I just went, well, gosh. And then my daughter was born several years later, and she was picking up the toy trucks and just cuddling them. So what you're saying in the book is that I didn't fail the gender socialization test, that really biology was what saved me, that really biology was at play. So can you talk a little bit about your observations that you saw, among the chimpanzees and some of the other ones that kind of led you to think more about how biology and toys and play kind of work together?
Yeah. Well, about the gender-neutral education, I don't understand it, because for boys, you know that they will be stronger when they're adult than women. You know that, and a lot stronger, because it has been tested, and there's very little overlap in the physical strength between men and women. You also know that they're going to be more violent. All the data on human homicide, you look in all the data on the primates that we have, they're going to be more violent. So why would you even take the risk of doing a gender-neutral education if you know that you have kids there that you need to educate in a different direction? They need to be responsible adults who use their physical strengths in a constructive way rather than an abusive way, and so you need to teach them these skills. So and another thing that I don't understand is that with young kids, I can see how you can raise them gender neutral, like if they're below 10 years of old, I can see how that can work. But they're going to reach puberty at some point, they're going to develop sexual interests, and we know that they're never gender neutral. We know they're always related to one gender or the other. So again, you're creating some confusion there. So gender neutral upbringing, I'm puzzled why people would want to do that, and I think it's a risky business at the moment. With the other primates, there is not an active, they don't have these books that tell them how to raise kids, and so they just raise them, and they do treat young females different from young males, and we know, for example, that in chimpanzee studies that the young females, they stay closer to their mother usually in the first couple of years than the young males who roam more around. And that's not because I think the mother is treating them necessarily differently, but they allow that for the young males and they don't allow that necessarily for the young females. So there are some of these differences. There's actually very little research on that. When I wrote the book, I was surprised by how little we actually know about, for example, gender diversity, because each individual is different and has a different mix of masculinity and femininity, and we don't have good data on that. So we in primatology, and I think this is true also in human society, we like to talk about the typical male and the typical female, and we focus on them. But there's all sorts of individual variability. There's all sorts of individuals who are not necessarily typical, and we sort of ignore that. And I think in human society we have done the same thing to some degree. And that's why people are now all in arms about that discussion about transgender people, is because now all of a sudden they have to think slightly differently about the issue, because that's not typical male, typical female.
I think my concerns about gender socialization really stemmed from the concerns about cultural conformity and the rules about cultural conformity, and that we assign gender or we assign sex at birth based on external genitalia, but you don't necessarily know how that's going to be expressed, and that we have these social norms, and as humans we like to categorize and label things. So I had to chuckle a little bit whenever you described Donna, who you showed a little while ago, as an asexual gender non-conforming individual, and I chuckled because I was wondering if that was something that you had decided on, or if you felt like you had to include that because you knew that other humans reading your book were going to want a label that you put on it, because I know you talked about not wanting to necessarily label things in your book. And so if you would share a little bit more about Donna with the audience, but I also wanted to ask how, when you were originally observing, or the people, the field workers were originally observing Donna, how did y'all characterize and classify these behaviors? A lot of times we bring our own experiences to this. So how did that look to the field workers as y'all were experiencing these new behaviors that you're
I think we didn't know what to do with her, because on my team I had quite a few gay and lesbian workers, actually, who were very fascinated by Donna, and initially we speculated maybe she's lesbian or something like that. But then we noticed that when she turned adolescent, that she was not interested in sex. Not with males, not with females. And she actually never had children. She stayed away from sex, and others were not bothering her to have sex with her. And so lesbian was not the best label, and that's how I ended up in this gender non-conforming. The interesting thing about individuals who are more homosexual than heterosexual, which we have, and individuals like Donna who don't show sex-typical behavior, is that it's not a problem. It's in primate society, it's never a problem. I've never noticed that they care about it, or that Donna was very well integrated and accepted by both the males and the females, even though she acted very differently. She was completely accepted. And so the intolerance that we have in human society, partly it may come from all the labeling that we do. The LGBTQ, that's all labeling right there. We put a label on everything. And partly we are very normative. We are a society that sets rules and enforces rules. And the primates do that also to some degree, but not to the degree that an individual who deviates a little bit from the patterns is going to be not tolerated.
You said something earlier during your presentation about male anthropologists or scientists not really liking some of the things that they saw in the bonobos because of their preconceived notion about how certain groups worked. How do you see scientist and observer bias kind of shading or biasing our observations, or the observations that have been made in the field? And do you see any hope for a reduction in bias as we start seeing a larger number of people from different backgrounds starting to participate in science and these types of works?
Yeah, it's a very important issue. We always bring our background to what we do, and the science itself doesn't change. The science rules of how you collect your data and how you present your data and do the statistics on it and all of that, those rules don't change, but the perspective of the scientist is different. And so when the first, for example, women came into primatology, when I was a student, there was mostly men. By now, I think 75% of the primatologists are women. When women came into the field, they had very different interests. The men were describing primate groups as basically run by males and very hierarchical, and they were very focused on territoriality and dominance and stuff like that. And when the women came in, they were interested in family relationships, in kinship relationships, in female choice, so that the matings are not just decided by the males, but also by the females. And so they brought in very different topics. And that cultural background or gender background has an enormous effect. So for example, I'm Dutch, and I think it makes a difference also in how I write about gender, because homosexuality has never been illegal. For the last 2 centuries, it has not been illegal in the Netherlands, and gay marriage was for the first in our country. And the attitude to individuals who deviate from the common patterns is very different in the Netherlands, a much more liberal country. And so that makes automatically that I write different about these issues than other people would, and that I'm not upset, so to speak, that primates may be homosexual. And even the word upset is sort of interesting. When the first reports came on homosexual behavior in the primates, and they were reported by a woman, Linda Wolfe, who described wild macaques where males would jump on males and females would jump on females, and she described all that. And she was ridiculed, and people did not accept it. The people were very upset by her descriptions, and they would literally say something like, maybe these monkeys don't see the difference between a male and a female. I call it the confused monkey hypothesis. Yeah, so they had that sort of idea about it, and now we know that it's actually quite common behavior, but people were not accepting it. And so sometimes, yeah, we have these biases, and the more different the backgrounds of people are, I think the better we can fight these biases. We have the same thing between Japanese primatology and Western primatology. Japan has a lot of primatologists because they have monkeys in Japan, and they have a very different way of looking at things. And so, yeah, the more variety we have, the better. Yeah.
So I was thinking about self-socialization as you were talking about that, and also the cultural norms and rules that we have for gender. And you know, it's not, at least for me and a lot of the studies that I've seen, it's not just your interactions with other individuals, but also the what you view. And you know, we have Netflix now, and I was flipping through a few days ago, and I realized there's a lot of reality television shows that are on there. And as I was kind of watching through, I realized that you know, it kind of looked like some of the stuff I saw in your book. There are these, you know, alliances, betrayals, friendships, you know, clandestine sexual affairs, power plays. And that people were really delighting in watching this, and the people on these, you know, instigate things. So obviously our ape cousins don't have Netflix, but do they enjoy instigating drama? Do they enjoy watching drama and watching these types of relationships unfold? And how does that play into them creating their own cultural norms and you know, how gender plays out?
That's a bad question, because I'm thinking of an example that is offensive maybe to some people, but we had a chimpanzee female who liked to stir trouble between males. So she would sexually excite one male and then sexually excite another male, and then she would just watch what would happen between those two. And I found that very unpleasant as a situation. But she was known for that, and we talked, my group, we talked about her that way, as like she's a troublemaker. So yeah, so we have that kind of behavior sometimes, yeah.
So, you know, you talk about how gender is not really the problem, it's the inequitable society. You know, based on what has made us uniquely human in our culture and our cultural structures, do you think that there's a way for us to unlearn a lot of what has led to this inequitable society and try to construct something that's a little bit more fair without having to give up the differences that we see that makes the, you know, people beautiful?
I think it's possible, and we're already doing that in some degree, because we have now equal education for boys and girls, which has consequences for the jobs they take later in life, and that is actually a fairly new development. And there used to be a lot of talk about intellectual differences between boys and girls. It's like men were traditionally considered more intelligent than women. But since we have equalized the education, those differences have disappeared. And if you now test men and women on certain standard intelligence tests, you're not going to find much of a difference between the two. And so we don't talk much about the intellectual differences anymore, because they are hard to find. And so we are already doing that to some degree. I sometimes think, but I'm not an economist, I'm just a primatologist, but I think the way we treat household work is not right in our economy. I think 40% of the work that we do in the economy is something that we do in-house with kids or the house or maintaining the house and so on. And it's unpaid work. And it seems to me that there's something screwy in the economy if there's 40% of the work that is not recognized. So I think something needs to be done there. Yeah. I don't know what. But.
I have really enjoyed the conversation. I could ask you so many more questions. I keep looking at my husband over there going, okay, we're gonna have to have this conversation about work. But I wanna be able to open it up and let some of the audience members ask questions, because I know that y'all have some. So there's a microphone that should be coming around.
I could ask this in Dutch, but I don't think anybody else would understand me. You have talked about a comparison with what, for some reason that I don't understand, we call the civilized world. But have you also looked between the behavior of the apes and, say, tribes in the Amazon or the Bushmen, and so are they much closer in their behavior?
Oh, I'm not sure that they're closer in their behavior. They're all human and they all have their own culture. And I'm sure if you start looking into it, they also have gender expression and gender variability. So the anthropologists, I'm not sure they're paying so close attention to, like, let's say, the universality of sex differences versus the cultural effects of sex differences. There are always stories in terms of the dominance relationship, there are always stories of matriarchal societies. And I think they exist and they have existed, or at least societies where women have a lot more influence than in other societies. But the variability in that, in human cultural variability, is not something that people study. The only study that I know is a female anthropologist who went around the world, and I think she studied 10 different cultures before. This was before the TV era, it was in the 1950s. She studied 10 different cultures on how boys and girls are being treated in the families. And she reported that in all these human cultures, the girls stay more at home than the boys are more allowed to roam outside, and the girls are more involved in household tasks and baby-related tasks and babysitting, that kind of stuff, than the boys are. And so that was a universal thing that she found. And so that may be something related to the biology of humans. Yeah.
I'm curious if you can give examples of the way a dominant male, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
The way a dominant male would exert dominance over females in the group, and in the case of bonobos, the way a dominant female would exert dominance over the males in the group, and also what evolutionary conditions would give rise to female dominance, such as bonobos.
Yeah, so there is sometimes a misconception, is that people think that female dominance is going to be nicer than male dominance. And I hear that sometimes. For example, I've recently done some podcasts about female leadership, and they present female leadership very often in a sort of very friendly way. And I always ask, so what happens if at the board meeting another woman tries to undermine the position of the female leader? What do they do? And I don't think it's pretty what they do necessarily. So a female bonobo, who's the alpha female, she's very harsh. She will punish other females and she will punish males if they transgress certain boundaries. And so I think the alphas of both genders, they need to be very strict, otherwise they lose their position. If you're not strict, it will be taken by somebody else. And so in that regard, they are similar. It is possible that the males use more physical force. They have a tendency to do that. And so male leadership is often more tied up with their physical abilities. But other than that, I think they're very similar in their dominance behavior. The reason why bonobos have female dominance is a bit of a puzzle, and people don't know exactly. The bonobos live in a forest that is richer and where they have no competition of gorillas. So the chimps live usually in forests where there are gorillas, and the gorillas eat the ground vegetation. And so the bonobos have all the vegetation of the forest available. And as a result, the females can travel together. They don't need to disperse over the forest to get enough food. They can travel together. And they hang out together a lot, the female bonobos. And so that has made their collective dominance possible, which for chimps is going to be very difficult because the chimp females don't always connect and are usually at distances from each other. So there may be an ecological reason why that made it possible for the bonobos to go that direction. But you know, female dominance is not very typical in the primate order, and so there may be other reasons for that. I don't know.
I was just wondering, you showed arrows that showed the humans versus the primates and what age they hit adult. And I was wondering if you've done any analysis of men versus women humans versus men versus women primates, because as a single mom of a now 23-year-old boy, I've noticed that boys appear to stay younger much longer.
Immature, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's typical for young males. In chimpanzees, for example, the males, they end puberty, so to speak, at 16 or so, 15, 16, but are really not ready yet to enter the hierarchy of the adult males. The adult males will keep them down, and that's only like 5, 6 years later that they can do that. And so they have a very difficult time because they are physically fully grown males, but the adult males don't take them seriously. And they have to fight for that. They have to show that they can do that. And the females also don't take them seriously at that age. And so I think that's a very difficult time for these young males. And they have a lot of physical energy. They're potentially dangerous because of all that physical energy that they have. And that's why it's very important to have adult males around to keep them down. So if you have sometimes that happens at zoos, that they have a group of chimpanzees and they add some young males to it, like 15, 16 years old. That's a very dangerous thing to do because these males are not in control of their physical abilities yet. And the most striking example that I know of this is in elephants. In elephants, because of the ivory hunting, the biggest bulls are killed. And so there are certain parks where they don't have fully grown bulls anymore. They have only these adolescent bulls, immature. They're adult looking, but they're immature. And they kill females, they kill rhinoceroses, they kill all sorts of wildlife. And so what one park did in South Africa is they flew in 6 fully grown bull elephants and dropped them in that park. And all of a sudden, all the problems with the young males were solved. So they needed some big guys around, and their testosterone levels went way down from what they were before. And it's interesting that because we have discussions about families without fathers and what the effect is on sons to have that, is that the fathers don't need to do anything, I believe. Just like these male bulls in the elephants, they didn't need to do anything. Just walking around and being big and strong was sufficient in their case. And I think with humans, maybe the same thing. There are studies that show that fatherless families, the girls reach puberty earlier. The boys become unruly and suicidal and don't study as well and they're more jobless. And so the absence of a father, I think, has a big effect on them. And I think the socializing role of adult males is actually more important people think, I think. Yeah.
Thank you for a marvelous talk. I'm curious about what happens to newborn apes. Who adopts those? Do the males, and how do they feed them?
Oh, those when they're before weaning. So the young apes, they nurse for 5 years or so, but they can eat solid food after 1 year. They nurse for such a long time because the food supply is very irregular in the forest, and they need to supplement it. But that still means that for a male to adopt a youngster, it will need to be over 3 or 4 years, otherwise it's not going to work, I think. And so they cannot adopt a newborn. That's not gonna. There's no way for them to feed them.